Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And it's the 13th of December here, Friday afternoon, as we tape this in Scandinavia and some other parts of the world. St. Lucy's Day. It used to be the winter solstice before the Gregorian calendar replaced the Julian back in the 1500s, although many Protestant areas didn't catch up for quite a while. They were backward for quite a few years. So we are looking at some important shifts, and in particular, what's happening with Syria. Now, we were right at the heart of this because we've just had the very successful visit of Mother Agnes Mariam here in Washington, D.C. And some of the listeners to this program have done a great deal to help make that visit a success. And she thanks you, and I thank you, and above all, world history will thank you. She addressed the McClendon Group at the National Press Club. She had meetings with a number of congressmen and senators. We'll tell you about this in a minute. And above all, she has stirred up the vermin. The vermin are in high dudgeon about her visit. And this includes BuzzFeed. It includes The Guardian. And, of course, it includes Jeremy Scahill, of whom the question is now being raised. Cop out or cop? Jeremy Scahill putting up those ultimatums. But let's look at the Syrian turning point. I urge you to go to tarpley.net and look there to see the interview I did about 2 weeks ago by now. 2 weeks ago on the 14th, I think. It was right at the beginning of December. And it was the question, could we detect signs that the U.S. is dumping the Syrian death squads, the so-called Syrian rebels, right? Now that Al-Qaeda has taken over virtually every aspect of these Syrian death squads, are they going to be dumped? And the signs, as you recall, some time ago, were General Salim Idris, the CIA golden boy who was put at the head of the so-called Syrian Military Council or Free Syrian Army. These names are changing all the time. You remember what he said. He said that he would now drop his demand that President Bashar Assad had to leave the country, quit, resign, before any Geneva conference that would be attended by the forces supposedly led by Idris, and that Assad, he said, could essentially join with him, Idris, in a united front against the Al-Qaeda terrorist killers. And that, of course, was a big change. And we were hearing about the 1,500 Westerners, people from Europe and the United States, that are now fighting with the Islamist crazies in Syria, and how everybody's now afraid that they will come back and carry out terrorist actions. And there you could already see the path to a LIHOP event, a Let It Happen on Purpose event. They're not the rule. 9/11 was not one, but this could be one if it happens, where one of these characters comes back and decides to act out the techniques. It would be a terrorist attack inspired by, although perhaps not ordered by, something like the Nusra Brigade or the ISIS. Now, the ISIS, there's always a quibble with ISIS. Is it the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria? Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. More accurate, the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and Sham. That's the term. It's an emirate. It's a subdivision of a caliphate, and that gets you a little bit closer to the essence. These are people who want the caliphate, which puts them exactly on the same page with the imperialists, right? The imperialists say there should be a world empire, They call that NATO and the International Monetary Fund, and then there should be regional warlords. That's the future they hold out to humanity. And these guys say, fine, just we don't want to call it the International Monetary Fund. We want to call it the Caliphate. So remember, Idris already was signaling, and you could see that the world is changing. Now, the same day that Mother Agnes Mariam visited the State Department, and that was the Tuesday of this week, Tuesday, December 10th. On that Tuesday, December 10th, the State Department announced a cutoff of so-called non-lethal aid to the rebels. There's a lot of verbiage here. There's a lot of double entendre and God knows what. But the main idea is some kind of important aid, or whatever aid there is being cut off to these terrorist rebels. And that is a big change. And the justification, of course, is that there are certain warehouses in northern Syria, hard by the Turkish border, where various kinds of aid are stored. And a group of terrorist killers from the Islamic Front showed up. The Islamic Front showed up and said, hey, watch out, Nusra and ISIS are nearby, and they want to come and steal all your stuff. But we'll protect you, they said. Sounds like a fable of La Fontaine. We'll protect you. Except when they protected you, they took it all over and stole it all for themselves. Now, what's in those warehouses? Some stories say, well, generators, trucks, food, medicine, tents, other equipment, blankets, and so forth. That's the Western view. The RIA Novosti, I have to put in a good word for RIA Novosti because they're apparently not long for this world. I don't know what the exact circumstances are, but RIA Novosti says, no, wait a minute, those warehouses are full of weapons. There are at least small arms and ammunition, maybe some bazookas, maybe some RPGs, maybe some things like this. So the rebels have stolen them all. The main thing is, though, that the State Department is no longer in a position to maintain those deliveries. Now, there is a caveat. There's a proviso, which is that the U.S. is maintaining a smaller program of small arms and ammunition, which is conducted from Jordan into southern Syria. The claim is that in southern Syria, the terrorist killers are not as prevalent as they were up there in the north. But it is, to be sure, a great watershed in this entire situation. And now we're headed towards January. And in January, we're going to have some kind of Geneva conference in effect. The Geneva conference is going to be an interesting exercise because at this point, no Islamist will come. None of the terrorist groups, not Nusra, not ISIS, not the Islamic Front, as far as I can see, is going to be represented at Geneva. So the entire thing can be decided without them. And now the various commentators are all lamenting, I suppose, since they're warmongers under the skin, especially on National Public Radio, National Pentagon Radio. Those commentators are all whining that the fulfillment of the chemical weapons accord by the Syrian government is so seamless, it's so excellent, it's conscientious, it's punctilious, it's completely satisfactory, that the U.S. now depends on Assad for that accord to be carried out, because unfortunately for them, if the killers come in, then the accord is out the window. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. It's the 13th of December. Now, of course, for your holiday viewing, don't forget the Russian fleets on C-SPAN. We're not quite up in the top of the classification as we have been. I was going neck and neck with Gnome Chomsky there for a while. and I think I outdistanced him, at least for most of the week. But if you want to do something to impact the C-SPAN programming, go and dial up that Russian fleets lecture by me, Tarpley, on C-SPAN, and maybe we can get it rebroadcast. I see that C-SPAN does rebroadcasting, and some of the stuff they rebroadcast is, shall we say, unworthy. Whereas this is turning out to be, with 7,000 to 8,000 views, one of the most popular, and I haven't been able to do an exhaustive survey. It may well be the most popular Civil War event of the past, of the sesquicentennial, we might say, which is the ongoing anniversary. All right, now with Syria, the other big turning point is the Seymour Hersh article about the behind-the-scenes intelligence fakery of the Ghouta massacre and the U.S. response to that in late August and September. And you will recall that the entire world was brought to the brink of a general war in the Middle East, and quite possibly World War III, on the basis of social media, thanks to Skull and Bones Kerry, and, of course, Obama, who now the world knows does not pay attention to details. He's, loftily floating off into his own narcissistic universe, or perhaps some sports game that he prefers to watch. So they were really very close to starting World War III. I would just say parenthetically, maybe the difference between Obama and somebody like Lyndon B. Johnson is that when the intelligence community organized the Gulf of Tonkin, Johnson bought it eagerly. In the case of Obama, there is at least some moment of reflection. There's at least some moment of what's good for Obama here, right? Forget about the country. We've given up on that quite a long time ago. But in the case of Obama, there is some moment of reflection or quality control, or considering what the results would be, and that was, of course, that famous Friday afternoon walk around the grounds of the White House with McDonough, the head of the chief of staff at the White House. Notice that Rice and Kerry were frozen out of that particular decision. So now we get the background, and the story of this is very interesting in itself. It is Seymour Hersh, the leaker-in-chief, the establishment's well-known and well-recognized leaker. He receives leaks from networks inside these bureaucracies, the Pentagon and so forth, primarily, and that's where then we get these leaks. So he comes forward with these leaks right now. So essentially what he says is that during the time, in real time, in August and in September, there was no convincing intelligence picture. There was no preponderance of real evidence that the Assad government had used chemical weapons against rebels in Syria, or indeed against anybody else. And he had tried to get this published. Seymour Hersh tried to get this published in his usual outlet, which is the New Yorker magazine, and they wouldn't print it. Isn't that interesting? Oh, and then he went on to the Washington Post. And now under Bezos, this is the first test of the Washington Post under Bezos, and there we find that Bezos is not willing to do anything daring at all. So the answer there was also no. So Sy Hersh then had to turn to the London Review of Books, and that's where you can find it. It's in the 8th of December edition of the London Review of Books. So the headlines, of course, that you've seen, that Obama and his associates cherry-picked the intelligence. Now, I would say this is likely to be Susan Rice and when we go through this story now, remember that the person who is supposed to prevent this kind of monstrosity is the director of the National Security Council. So the principal demand that we make is that Rice has to be fired. Susan Rice must go. I would say at the same time, Samantha Power must go because of the way that she's climbed out on a limb. So here we go. The article is called Who's Sarin? That is to say, to whom does the sarin belong? Barack Obama did not tell the whole story when he tried to make the case about Bashar Assad responsible for the chemical weapons near Damascus on the 21st of August. He omitted important intelligence. He presented assumptions as fact. Most important, he failed to acknowledge that the U.S. intelligence community was well aware that the Syrian army is not in possession of a monopoly on sarin, but that the rebels had equally or comparable access and ability to create it. And that means the Nusra Front, allied to al-Qaeda, had mastered the mechanics of creating sarin and was capable of manufacturing it in quantity. Well, remember, there was the famous video of the rabbit being put to death with sarin as a test, which they then put up on the internet. So we were told, you'll remember, with his speech on the 10th of September, Obama blamed Assad, and he said that this was a red line. Assad's government had gassed to death over 1,000 people. We know the Assad regime was responsible, said Obama. That is why, after careful deliberation, we must respond to the Assad's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike. And then remember, Obama went through a list of supposed stories. Seymour Hersh now compares it, obviously, to the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident. And again, the one thing we can be glad of is that it's not a complete congruence, but only a large one. Immense frustration in the military intelligence bureaucracy about Obama. They say Obama and his cronies in the White House make up the intelligence as they go along. Again, I would focus this in particular on something that we could get and would be better off getting in the short run. Susan Rice out, Samantha Power out. And we'll have a little bit more about the Seymour Hersh story here in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we've got Seymour Hersh and his article, Who's Sarin? You should read this. Here's what you should do. Get a hold now of the dossier, the report assembled by Mother Agnes Mariam. You find that on tarpley.net. And then compare that to Seymour Hersh. Now, I'm thankful for Seymour Hersh. I welcome Seymour Hersh. I think he does valuable work. The only thing we could say is this is 3 months after the fight. The fight was 3 months ago. The decision was made 3 months ago. If you look at the Seymour Hersh article, you will see that if you listen to this program, read tarpley.net, and took a look at that dossier by Mother Agnes Mariam, you knew just about everything in the Seymour Hersh article. There's very little in the Seymour Hersh article that's new. I'll tell you there are some new things, and we should highlight those. But generally speaking, you listeners, you knew this stuff, and you were hopefully in a position to do something, to fight, to put on Twitter. That's something anybody can do, to make a call to the White House, to send an email, to do something, to put up a sign, to take part in a demonstration, to make your voice heard in some way. And the other thing, of course, is that with Seymour Hersh and these people, there's no implementation. My implementation is fire Susan Rice. You'll remember that back during the Iraq War, during the post-9/11 period, there was a great deal of criticism of how uncoordinated and chaotic the Bush administration was. And most people who know how the government works blamed Condoleezza Rice. No relation. Condoleezza Rice was up to then the worst National Security Council director that we had, just at this technical administrative level of managing the bureaucratic input. Because remember, in the build-up to the attack on Iraq and indeed Afghanistan, especially Iraq, it was possible to practice a constructive fraud on the entire U.S. federal government, right, through an inside-outside operation run by these neocons, right, run by the various Shulskis and Pearls and Fife and the rest of them, right, the infamous Wolfowitz neocon faction. But now you've got the same thing going on, done through social media. So Susan Rice must go, and her counterpart, Samantha Power. Samantha Power has a statement in this article, which she made at the time, right, which we mocked and jeered at, that it's important to remember that only the Syrian regime has access to chemical weapons. Well, no. So there's cherry picking, there's misrepresentation, and so forth, right? And lots of lies. So it's the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, here's the thing. The U.S. government, here's one thing that we learned from Seymour Hersh that we didn't know, that there were sensors, that the U.S. has somehow been able to deposit these espionage devices, a secret sensor system inside Syria designed to provide early warning of any change of the status of the regime's chemical weapons arsenals. The sensors are monitored by the National Reconnaissance Office, the agency that controls the satellites, and they get the data from these things. They would alert the U.S. and the Israelis, of course, if warheads are being loaded with sarin. A chemical warhead once loaded with sarin has to be used, right, within a couple of days. Use it or lose it. So they have to get down to business. So the sensors had worked in the past. The Syrian leaders knew it. But in this case, there was no conclusive evidence of any kind from the sensors that the Syrian government was doing anything in terms of loading up warheads and getting ready to shoot them off. So that's number one. The second one that stands out, I think, is the story about Assad. Can you link President Bashar Assad to any of these activities? Did he ever give an order? And the story is that there's a network, I don't know whether it's sensors or microphones or spies or cell phones, God knows what, that they could not pin it on Bashar Assad. There was no way of saying he gave the order. There's no smoking gun, no signed piece of paper, no taped telephone conversation, no proof. And therefore, we have this scandal. The administration's distortion of the facts about sarin raises an unavoidable question. Do we have the whole story of Obama's willingness to walk away from his red line threat to bomb Syria? Now, I extend an engraved invitation to Congressman Darrell Issa, the richest man in Congress. He's got the money and the time to do this. The one who's been so concerned about the Benghazi incident without ever calling General David Petraeus to be grilled in public about the orders given to the CIA, without ever calling General Carter Ham to respond. What about those air assets you had at Sigonella, Sicily? Why were they not engaged? Why didn't you get involved? And if you were ordered not to do it, then give us the stand-down order. We want to see that in writing, because certainly you would never accept such an order unless it's in writing. It's like Kirk Douglas in the movie when the guy says, bombard your own troops. He says, I need that in writing for the post-disaster explanations. So Darrell Issa has struck out on this manufactured Benghazi question, right? That was an October surprise by Romney and neocon forces trying to get Obama out, Romney in, and above all, the neocons in, right? People like Robert Kagan, top foreign policy advisor to Romney and the husband of this awful woman, Victoria Nuland, who has been cavorting with neo-fascists and neo-Nazis now in the streets of Kiev. Well, we want Congressman Issa to get now to the bottom of this. We want to know what was the intelligence basis of this decision, right, of what Obama said. This could be real. If we pull on this cord, we can get rid of Susan Rice, get rid of Samantha Power, and oust other warmonger, neocon, old-fashioned Brzezinskiite networks, you name it. In other words, the worst imperialists of any stripe have to be tracked down. So this is a really big thing. It's much bigger than Benghazi, right? 4 dead. Well, they get 4 dead every week in Afghanistan or every day in Iraq a couple of years ago, right? It's very serious, but still, this is worse. Now, there was obviously some of them said this was the Zimmerman telegram. Here, one of the ones who was one of the warmongers, according to Cy Hersh. The new director of the CIA, John Brennan, jumped to the conclusion. He drove to the White House and said, "Look at what I've got." It was all verbal. They were only waving the bloody shirt of the victims at Ghouta. There was a lot of political pressure to bring Obama to the table to help the rebels. There was wishful thinking that blaming Assad for the sarin attack would force Obama's hand. This is the Zimmerman telegram of the Syrian rebellion, and now Obama must react. Wishful thinking by Samantha Power, by her wing of the administration. And some of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we're told here, who were alerted that it was going to attack, weren't so sure it was a good thing. Now, that last part about the Joint Chiefs, maybe, because you got to remember that the stuff that Cy Hersh is getting comes from the Pentagon, and it may have been vetted by some of the Joint Chiefs, right? So they're anxious to blame the CIA and the State Department. But you get the idea. There is a real scandal lurking here, and it can be used to put the warmonger elements around Obama very much on the defensive. So we're wondering, anybody still alive in the Democratic Party? Anybody concerned about a brush with World War III on the basis of a Gulf of Tonkin fraud? Worse than weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. So our demand has to be fire Brennan at the CIA, the guy who wanted to use the Ghouta massacre as the Zimmerman telegram, of course. World War I, dubious telegram, probably a forgery by the British, but the Germany proposes to Mexico that Mexico attack the U.S. and get back what was lost in the 1848-49, get back the Southwest states, Texas, and up to California, and so forth. That's Brennan eagerly grabbed the Ghouta event. Now it can be told. Susan Rice, we knew. Samantha Power, we knew. Let's just quote Samantha Power again. We've got her dead to rights here. She says, 21st of August, Samantha Power at the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador, tells a press conference, quote, "It's very important to note that only the Assad regime possesses sarin, and we have no evidence that the opposition possesses sarin." A lie, an outright lie. This is like saying, oh, nobody ever thought that airplanes could be used as weapons by crashing them into buildings, that you've heard to that extent. So this is pretty much the essence of Seymour Hersh. Now, again, it's great to have all this stuff, and we can be more specific. But in effect, this is the line that Mother Agnes Mariam was pioneering. Now, let's look at the London Guardian. We have the unfortunate Rhea Jalabi. Rhea Jalabi, or Jalopy, should have waited a couple of days here, because her story is that Assad's forces are, sponsoring, they're favoring Mother Agnes Mariam, and the story is that people don't believe her version that it may have been the rebels, or it's not known who carried out the Ghouta chemical weapons massacre on August 21st. So this poor woman, Rhea Jalapi, has got egg all over her face now. Shortly after the fact, she could have held off for a couple of days. Then this Seymour Hersh thing came along and changed the entire climate of opinion. And I would just point to this, right? You look at the London Guardian, and you are dealing, I think you can see with this, with an imperialist rag. This is a scurrilous propaganda sheet for the withered mummy of British imperialism. Tries to make it look trendy, tries to make it look a little bit up to date. But this is Colonel Blimp talking through, some London, Carnaby Street, whatever. So how, if you think about the absolutely critical role of the London Guardian in inflicting Ed Snowden on the world, you'd have to wonder, right, given this really dirty role of the Guardian against Mother Agnes Mariam, how can you assume that things printed in the Guardian are news as distinct from falsifications coming from the kitchen of lies at MI6 and MI5? And you'll recall, I've been slandered by the Guardian because of my raising of this issue. What is your relation to British intelligence? To what degree do you repeat things from British intelligence? Tell us. We'd like to know. We've also got the unfortunate Rosie Gray of BuzzFeed, and she also got out in front of these developments just by a couple of days. Both of these charming ladies could have helped their own careers by writing nothing, waiting for the Seymour Hersh stuff to come out, and then putting it in perspective. But Rosie Gray and BuzzFeed, this is even more scurrilous, right? Because it's more scurrilous. Assad's favorite nun. Okay, Assad's favorite nun. Now, Mother Agnes Mariam is not the Assad government. She is a critic of the Assad government. But being a critic doesn't mean that you start an armed insurrection. That's the issue. Do you support an armed insurrection carried out by these bearded lunatics, by the cannibals, by the people whose idea of fun is to lop off hands, lop off heads, harass women? They killed a boy. Remember, he made a joke about how difficult it was to get served. Not even a leading religious figure in Islam could have gotten served that day, he said. That was enough. Took him out, shoot him, and killed him. You'd like to live under that? Okay. Maybe we should get together a group of these left liberals, and they can go and essentially put themselves under the control of Nusra, or I'm understanding now that ISIS or Islamic Emirate of Iraq and Sham is more extreme, or any of them, and see how they like it. When the choice comes down to that kind of chaos or a government, even if the government is repressive, and it's repressive, I think, on a sort of case-by-case basis, you have to choose law and order and civilization rather than warlords, endless conflict, theft, beheadings, lopping off hands, and cannibalism. So these people, if they say, oh, you support Assad, well, the answer is you support cannibalism. You're an enemy of civilization. And that's the way it goes. So the BuzzFeed is shocked that she was going to meet Senator Cruz. It didn't quite pan out because, let me just point out, there were three factors. One was the snow emergency here in Washington, D.C. There was the Nelson Mandela funeral. Some of the top people she was scheduled to meet had to then fly off to the Nelson Mandela funeral, and that's certainly understandable. And there were some other problems. That you had a number of different centers that were trying to program events for her, so some conflicts emerged. But she did attend the McClendon group. She did get to give a speech at the National Press Club, and she did go to the State Department. I believe she's going to she did have an interview on the Huckabee radio program, but this character Weiss is continuing his work of slander. And one of the slanders is that Mother Agnes Mariam is somehow involved in the murder of Gilles Jacquier, a French journalist, which she has denied this. She's repudiated, and she's suing the people who make this charge for slander, I believe, in France. All right, so that's the Syrian situation. On the whole, I guess we can say that Mother Agnes Mariam has come to Washington and now departed back to the Middle East on the wings of victory. And the victory is that the fraud practiced on world public opinion by Western intelligence agencies, certainly by the CIA, the DG, the French Direction Générale des Services Extérieurs, DGSE, and the British MI6, and all the intelligence agencies, their agents embedded in the news media. This has been defeated. This is now in the process of being taken down. And it was Mother Agnes Mariam who led the charge, and some of us who were associated with that are very proud of that. And when you look at somebody like Scahill, who brought this up, right? Scahill says, if you allow her to attend the London anti-war conference, I, the great Scahill, I, the great rock star, will not attend. Look at how that looks now. The things that Mother Agnes Mariam is saying are essentially validated and even amplified by some of these points from Seymour M. Hersh, and he's in the respectable London Review of Books. One interesting, if you want to see a Damascus Road conversion, take a look at the interview of Seymour Hersh by the great Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! This week. And you'll see Amy, who was perfectly happy to blame this massacre on Assad. Of course, Assad the tyrant, Assad intolerable, Assad anything you want. In the presence of the great Poobah Seymour Hersh, who's basically up there in the same rarefied atmosphere as Noam Chomsky and others, as one of the the gods in the left liberal pantheon. Amy Goodman had to reverse her line. So thank you, Seymour Hersh, and thank you, but above all, thank you to Mother Agnes Mariam. And we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, the second hour here on December 13th, 2013. So, again, the outcome of that entire episode is there is no proof that Assad and the Syrian government carried out a chemical weapons massacre. There is much proof that Nusra, ISIS, Saudis, and related forces carried out the massacre. We want the firing of Brennan at the CIA. Of course, this is the agency that's supposed to tell us about these things. But Susan Rice is supposed to coordinate information flows into the White House, make sure the president is informed, and the incendiary passionaria Samantha Power must be fired. So those three have to be fired. Get out your Twitters and go after them. And don't let Jeremy Scahill ever live it down. What he did in the past couple of weeks to try to sabotage these efforts against the warmonger clique is just a scandal. Now, let's look at another aspect. Ukraine. Now, you know that the pro-war left, the warmonger left, believes in humanitarian intervention, and they're dedicated to the mythology of things like the Orange Revolution in Kiev back in 2004. Well, as I was telling you in real time, the Orange Revolution was a lemon, and it was extremely dangerous. We were getting close to something much, much more dangerous than Iran because of that real estate being so critical, right? That's the glacis of Russia, and that is an area that is always going to be extremely sensitive. And yet this is one of the only places where nuclear powers can collide. Now, the current troubles in Ukraine apparently generated quite a lot by Poland and by Sweden. Now, I would just add that both Poland and Sweden have a very unfortunate history of being under the influence of British intelligence in particular, but that there is a there's a kind of an ad hoc group that includes Poland and Sweden, which is somehow, action into Eastern Europe, the coalition of meddlers and troublemakers and, of course, imperialists, because they do this for money. The European Union is offering Ukraine what has been, I think, accurately described as a semi-colonial deal. They are not offering membership. That's a fraud. Don't get the impression from all this coverage that membership is at issue. There is no offer of membership. No more for them than for the Turks. They're about as far away as the Turks from being allowed into Europe. So when they say we want Europe, we want the rule of law, what a load of malarkey. Plus, you want to take a look at the rule of law in the European Union. You're going to need a microscope to find such evidence. Rather, the idea is Ukraine as a sweatshop, Ukraine as a dumping ground, Ukraine as an area of exploiting labor, right, getting more cheap labor to come into the European Union to drive down wages. But above all, to create problems for Putin. This is anti-Putin. They're saying, oh, Putin, you're feeling your oats, huh? You avoided a world war in Syria, or at least a regional war. We'll show you, we'll get you, we'll punish you for what you've done. He did a public service to everybody in the world, but they're going to get him. So they want to bring down the Yanukovych government, right? And they really don't care much about how it happens. Poland and Sweden are out front. Certainly in the Orange Revolution of 2004, the Brzezinski family was directly out front. We'll have to check whether that is still the case or not. But now, who are these protesters, right? The Maidan Square, or the Independence Square, as it's known, right? Maidan. I'm afraid many of the protesters are neo-Nazis. I'm afraid they are neo-fascists. In particular, this group called Svoboda shows that, that's what they are. These are xenophobic neo-Nazis. These are the kind of people who look back fondly to the presence of the SS and everything else. In other words, their hatred for Russia is so great that they're willing to go all the way to this extreme of neo-Nazism and national Bolshevism. Most commentators don't tell you this, and I've even heard Russian commentators who seem to be soft-peddling that fact, but there it is. The Svoboda Party, I think, would fill the bill in that case. So essentially what you have is fascist gangs trying to organize a coup d'etat. I mean, you could think of it, Mussolini's March on Rome went off without a hitch. In other words, there was a march, they marched in, the government fell, the king called on Mussolini to form a government, and that was pretty quickly done. In this case, it's a march on Kiev, but it's very weak. It's a few thousand people. A lot of them are foreigners. A lot of them are hooligans who travel around Europe, right? Maybe a couple of weeks ago they were, shooting off rocket pistols at a soccer game or something like this, or shouting racist slogans at a soccer game. But now they're out they've transformed themselves into pro-democracy heroes, and they're now in the main square of Kiev. But they've bogged down. And of course, it's easy to compare this to what was done to Occupy, what the U.S. routinely does to protesters. McPherson and all these other places were simply gotten rid of. So the hypocrisy, of course, is very high. But this is not the main point. This is maybe 5,000 to 10,000 at the very most, with a lot of foreign hooligans coming in. Svoboda is a big component. And then we have this guy Klitschko, this big prize fighter. Technically, I think he is still the heavyweight champion of the world, according to somebody's apostolic succession. This guy is punch drunk. He is somebody who has been punched in the head too many times. We have heard about, and correctly, about concussions in the National Football League. This poor guy reminds us of Rocky in the latter episodes of the Rocky story, right, when brain damage has begun to manifest itself. So Klitschko, who can hardly talk, this punch-drunk puppet. They want him for president of the Ukraine? I'm sorry. This is absolutely crazy. So that's part of the grotesque stuff going on in the public square. And then we have Victoria's Secret, right? This is the time of year when everybody's eyes turn to the Victoria's Secret show, when, people put themselves on parade, they put themselves on display, they exhibit themselves. And who do we have? Victoria Nuland, of course, the Victoria in question. Victoria Nuland, that is to say, Mrs. Robert Kagan, neocon and warmonger. She's been promoted, right? She was the spokes at the State Department during Benghazi, and you'd think that Issa would have been able to put an end to her promotion at least, but no, there she is. She's now Assistant Secretary of State, handing out tasty cakes, or were those Hostess Twinkies, maybe some stale ones, to the cops and to the demonstrators with the U.S. ambassador. And this continues this really scandalous parade of Lithuanian, Polish, Swedish, and other European Union officials blatantly interfering in the internal affairs of Ukraine by giving raving speeches to these crowds. So she should be fired. Let's put her on the list of this week, right? The targets for firing this week are Brennan, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, and Victoria Nuland at the State Department. And throw in this U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Now, we'll have a couple of more things to say about Ukraine in just a second. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. Take some time off during these holidays to look at the Russian Fleet's lecture. If you haven't seen it, even if you have, take a look at it again. Try to get that up in the rankings. Try to get it rebroadcast 2 or 3 times now during the next couple of weeks. Remember, they do have the Civil War history, but the 150 years ago, the armies had gone into winter quarters, so there was not that much going on. So they will be increasingly dependent on reruns, and that is where this talk of mine might come in handy. Remember that it's one of the most viewed of all the Civil War broadcasts. Now, let's just say a few more words about Ukraine. Right now, it's expected that this weekend will bring bigger demonstrations, right? Because people have off, and there's also hooligans coming in, right? You get one kind of person goes to Syria to pick up a gun, and the other kind would go to someplace like Ukraine to be a street fighter, right? You get your football helmet, you get your precision slingshot, get a few other things, and there you go. But now, the official line from Kerry had been rather detached. In other words, it had been measured, and I think this was a sign of some wisdom. Kerry, though certainly evil, certainly skull and bones, this will not change, is not quite at the same level of priority of firing as what we've just gone through, right? Nuland, Brennan, Samantha Power, and the awful Susan Rice. But he actually signaled a somewhat more moderate line. But now it looks like the State Department establishment, or at least a wing of it, the neocon types, the holdovers, and so forth, that they've just gone ahead and made their own policy, right? They've gone into the streets. They voted with their feet. I think what Kerry is reflecting is that, objectively speaking, in today's world, the tendencies to have a U.S.-Russian condominium over much of the world are strong. This is strong in the Middle East, strong in Europe, maybe less strong in Latin America and in Asia, but certainly this idea of a U.S.-Russian, Russian-American condominium, this is definitely there. But the people that are provoking, right, the various Victoria's Secret people, they're trying, I think, to make their own policy. Now, let's just look at what the solution would be for Ukraine. Certainly, the neo-Nazis are not the solution. I hope everybody agrees. Klitschko, the punch-drunk fighter, is not a solution. He needs to be in therapy. Timoshenko, the kleptocrat, the gas princess, who is now also a hero of human rights and democracy. They say that Yanukovych is corrupt. Well, Timoshenko can give anybody a run for their money in terms of corruption. She's a kleptocrat and a NATO agent from the word go. But, so what is the answer? Well, the answer, again, is not personalities. It's economic development. And here's what we find. The current situation of Ukraine is a foreign debt of about $140 billion U.S. dollars. Now, at the current rate, and I don't know whether these characters from Sweden and Poland had thought about this, that is on the road to default. And I would suggest what Ukraine needs, the condign punishment for the Western European financiers and their U.S. Wall Street confrere, is a debt moratorium to say, look, sorry, you've inflicted practically chaos here on our national capital. We can't pay. The Russian television today had a woman who's part of the wine industry, right? The Crimean coast of Ukraine is a great wine area, right? What Russians use for champagne often comes from places like Romania or the Crimea. So she said that she had 5 truckloads of wine that she wanted to send into Russia. She could have made 250,000 euros on the deal. She couldn't do it because the export permit was not issued because the administration in Kiev was shut down. So you say, look, sorry, NATO, you sent in your hooligans, and now you pay. But then what do? We're back again to the BRICS Bank. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. I don't know what you're waiting for. Seems like every week we have new examples, right? It was certainly Egypt. It was certainly Syria is going to need a economic development and reconstruction program. As I said in one of these TV interviews on Press TV, Ukraine would need an immediate infusion of something like $10 billion. What's with the BRICS Bank? Let's get going, BRICS. You're letting all of these opportunities go by. Ukraine is another perfect example of putting this into action. And again, you don't just pass the money out. You start building and rebuilding infrastructure. One of the things about Ukraine is that the eastern Ukraine, the so-called Donbas, was a very powerful, heavy industrial area with dams and steel mills and other kinds of industries created during the Soviet era at great sacrifice to the Soviet people. This can be rebuilt, refurbished, modernized, and remobilized, right? The future of the country is in industrial development, and of course in this area of east-west infrastructure and everything that goes with that. Some of these characters on National Public Radio are saying, well, maybe we'll have a new Arab Spring, right? We'll have an Arab Spring in Eastern Europe. I doubt it, because the Orange Revolution turned out to be such a lemon, and this is now such a lamentable show. The one that they would like to target, and don't ever forget it, is Belarus, because Belarus is an example of a country that has stayed much more within the limits of what is desirable, in other words, to have a modus vivendi with Russia. Belarus has essentially got this, and it will be part of the customs union that I think Ukraine might well end up joining. But certainly get these neo-Nazis out of the square, and don't anybody get sucked into thinking that those neo-Nazis are somehow a positive force. Now, changing gears, let's remember it's getting to be the last chance to stop the Yellen nomination. Hey, reactionaries, hey, Tea Party, where are you? Hey, anybody, stop Yellen. It's time for Tarpley for Fedhead, and I'll just remind you of why in a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So, Ukraine needs to get emergency financial aid from the BRICS Bank. It's time to stop Yellen. Yellen is an incompetent. Yellen is a tool of the banksters, of the Wall Street community. She operates under a little bit of left cover. That seems to be the main difference. Don't be fooled. Because remember, she comes in, she's simply going to continue QE3, a support operation for bankrupt derivatives. That's all it is. Buy up bankrupt derivatives, bankrupt collateralized debt obligations, CDO squared, super CDO, and all the rest of it, and try to prevent the ultimate reckoning with these bankrupt, toxic, kited instruments. So the alternative, of course, is what I represent. Let's open up a credit facility, right? During 2008, 2009, it was $27 trillion made available to zombie banks, including foreign zombie banks. We would like to get $5 trillion, please, right now, $1 trillion to refinance all student debt down to 0% interest. So at least we can freeze the problem on the way to a definitive solution. And we have some ideas what that might be. And then let's take the $4 trillion and then use that for infrastructure. Got to rebuild the entire infrastructure of the United States, roads, highways, commuter rail, freight rail, passenger rail, electricity grids, modern electrical generation. We've got to build schools, hospitals, and other public buildings, libraries. We've got to build ports, canals, and other such improvements. An immediate $4 trillion infusion on the way to 30 million productive jobs at union wages. Anything else is a bad joke. And this congressman, we've got a congressman from California who wants to double the federal gas tax to get money to build infrastructure. What about the Federal Reserve? Just because Lord Keane didn't say anything about it, is it taboo? Are we not going to say anything just because the Jobs for All coalition is too ignorant or too cowardly to talk about the necessity of nationalizing the Fed and using it, credit creation for job creation in national infrastructure projects? Are we supposed to just ignore the main credit source in the entire economy? Well, apparently, according to this one sorry guy out in California, yes. So that's why Yellen should not be approved, because she's simply going to continue the bankrupt policy of Bernanke. You put me in there, I'll give you that credit facility. So take counsel and do something about it. And of course, I remain available, even if they go with Yellen. Maybe they'll maybe some dramatic events will occur. No, quite seriously, where she will be untenable. Right, and it's unfortunate, but she's incompetent. There's no way around it. I don't care what her gender is; she's just incompetent. Now, a related example in Ireland, the finance minister of Ireland now says that the bailout is over, but killer austerity has to go on because you've got to get below the 3% target of the European Union. I mean, this is unbelievable. And I would ask the Ukrainians, do you want to join that? Because the first thing you'll get, if Ukraine joins the European Union, you'll get the Troika in there, right? The European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF. And the IMF is probably the one that's going to make the loan. And then if you get the IMF, you get IMF conditionalities. And if you get IMF conditionalities, that makes any other regime look good. Any one. Because the IMF is absolutely the worst. And they have no success stories. So that's Ireland. Now, concerning the budget deal, let me say first what the necessary strategy would have been. The fact that we don't have the necessary strategy is another indication of the uselessness of the Democratic Party. We've now got a 2-year federal budget guideline bill. This is an authorization bill. It's not appropriated yet, right? You got to go back and appropriate every individual one. But the general guidelines are, I think it's 1.0 0.06 or 0.7 trillion, right? The sequester number was down about 967 billion, and the Obama budget, which is quite austere, 1.2 trillion. So we're about somewhere in between those, but this is already being dragged well into the austerity area, God knows, and it's going to make it worse. So this is a monstrosity, and my word was and remains, vote no. Vote no on this turkey. Vote no if you're in the House. Vote no if you're in the Senate. Shoot this down, and there's a reason why. There are immediate questions involving the provisions, right? The first is there is no extension of the emergency unemployment benefits. That means 1.3 million individuals, which is probably 1.3 million families or thereabouts, will be deprived of all unemployment benefits on the 28th of December, which is, I think, already a war crime against the American people. During the course of the coming year of 2014, another 1.9 million people, families, will be deprived of unemployment benefits. So that gets us to 3.2 million people, families. We could be up to the area of 10 million Americans easily pitched into abject poverty. For what? Because the fascisto Republican Party believes in the Austrian school. Oh, then let me not skip the leading example. Little Rand Paul, having lived on silver spoons and cushioned settees all of his life, came forward last Sunday on one of the Sunday shows to say, he's in favor of 26 weeks of unemployment, but beyond that, he's against it. He doesn't want to do anything for the people that are on their way to being 99ers, and he doesn't want to do anything for the 99ers. And we've probably got, 200ers and 300ers by now that are victims of this depression. And he says the reason for that is if you're on unemployment for more than 26 weeks and a future boss, a job creator, reads your resume and sees that you've been unemployed that long, he's not going to hire you. So the answer is to remove the jobless benefit. Now, just for the addled mind of little Rand, there is something called causality in the universe, the causality. And what is causing this problem is not the availability of these meager unemployment benefits. The cause of the problem is a world economic and financial depression created in 2008 by Wall Street because of derivatives, because of deregulation, privatization, and in particular derivatives that should have been banned, that should have been taxed, that should have been regulated, and were not because of people supporting the Austrian school in the way that Rand does. So Rand says he would be against extending the unemployment benefit. Isn't that wonderful? Now you think of Scrooge, right? Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? How about the treadmill? Little Rand is in the area of Dickensian cruelty, and one wonders if he's ever faced economic penury or suffering of his own in his own life. But the problem that he can't understand is there are no jobs. If we have three candidates competing for every job that becomes available, it's inevitable that no matter what the energy and commitment and Horatio Alger mythological beliefs of the two, only one of them can get the job. So that, again, shows us what little Rand is made of. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. And welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So the unacceptable part of the budget is that there are no provisions to provide extended unemployment benefits. The states generally, some states at least, provide 26 weeks, some less. But then the federal government can provide more. And I think there's nothing up to 99 weeks anymore. I think the most you can get in any state is between 40 and 45 weeks. And this is wrong. It should be open-ended until the job creators start doing their job and create some jobs. Then, unfortunately, we're going to have extended unemployment benefits. Right? instead of qualifying as a job creator by having Boehner say that you are one, you should have to create some jobs. And maybe that would clarify this entire situation. So the other thing, of course, is that federal workers get gouged. They have to contribute more to their pensions. They're already paid less. This is unfair. There are other cuts. There are some Medicare cuts, more Medicare cuts in this rotten budget. So this is totally unacceptable. And the number, if Obama was asking for $1.2 trillion, and this one gives you 1.06 or 1.07 trillion, that is no good, even if it's better than the 0.967, which is the sequester number. A lot of the benefits of this go to the Pentagon, and I don't think this is the appropriate way to do it, right? Benefits to the Pentagon have got to be matched in multiples on the side of the domestic economy, as long as you've got this kind of a depression going on. The other problem is, of course, what should strategy be doing? The strategy has to be to destroy the Republican Party, not to prop it up, not to save it from itself, not to allow it to escape the consequences of its beliefs. Remember, the Tea Party has goals which are identical to the general goal of any reactionary Republican. The fascist Tea Party and the normal reactionary mainstream Republican want, by and large, the same things. The only thing is that the normal Republican has learned to be more clever, more Delphic, more deceptive, more manipulative, more of a cultural populist, and to hide more successfully what they really want. The benefit of the Tea Party, from our point of view, is they come out and say, we want fascist genocide against the American people. And that tends to make it understandable to at least some of the voters. So therefore, when you're faced with a situation like this, you need a strategy. It should be pick a very popular policy issue that you know the Tea Party has to oppose on pain of death. So you've got to say, extended unemployment benefits with provisions for the 99ers. Nobody goes hungry. No children are going to be in poverty in the United States. We're going to pay unemployment benefits. No Medicare cuts, and start rolling them back. It's hard for Democrats to do because Obama has already cut 0.7 trillion out of Medicare. We'll have to refight all of that in the future. And don't gouge federal workers so you get them, right? Important in quite a few states. So you pick a very popular policy point that the Tea Party has to oppose, and then you fight for that. You drive a wedge. You say, all right, shut down the government. Please, go ahead. You notice that the Republicans are scared out of their wits by another government shutdown. They're running away from their own tactics, the Tea Party tactics, because they don't work. The shutdown policy exposes the reactionary and fascist Republicans for what they really are. So therefore, make them do it. Make them start the new year, 2014, by shutting down the federal government, and let them concentrate the rage and the hate of the American people on them, because they deserve it. You nail them to the wall, and you drive them into a split to the point where you force the majority, the Boehner types, whatever you want to call them, the mainstream, to vote for something that they absolutely never would vote for, hoping to avoid total destruction. And the goal then should be their total destruction. And you'll notice also, though, that the split of the Democrats is also there, as we've seen, right? The most recent one is the fighting between the Progressive Change Campaign Committee on the one side and the Third Way on the other. So we've got self-styled populist pro-labor left-wing Democrats, very mixed-up people, but there it is. And then on the other side, you've got these third-way, right-wing sort of Democratic Leadership Council types. That is also latent. So destroy the Republican Party in place, and then split the Democratic Party into Wall Street plutocrats and pro-labor populists. And the United Front Against Austerity and the Tax Wall Street Party will be catalysts to show what the necessary policies are. The 1% Wall Street sales tax to finance the entire social safety net, including the increased Social Security benefits that Senator Warren correctly demands, but she doesn't tell us how to pay for them, and we don't want to have divide and conquer, and then get on to nationalizing the Fed. Notice, however, the demagogy of the left-wing Democrats. De Blasio, the new mayor of New York in a couple of weeks, has picked the racist Bratton as his police commissioner. So we go from Ray Kelly, the racist of stop and frisk, to a new brand. Bratton, probably the originator, the guy who introduced and perfected stop and frisk. So de Blasio, remember him? The fiscal conservative, as he unmasked a couple of days before the election. That's the kind of demagogy we don't need. In other words, whenever they're financed by Soros, whenever they have the deep pockets of Wall Street, then we know this is not good. Bernie Sanders is out with a single-payer insurance plan, and we're going to be looking at it. But here's what we're going to be looking for, that there be no rationing. This is now an important issue. Obamacare has rationing, of course. It's got these boards, right? These panels. You can call them death panels. They will function as death panels for some people. That is to say, the IMAC, MedPAC, Independent Medical Advisory Committee, Medical Committee. These are the ones that say what treatments are allowed for what people under what conditions. Now, of course, the Republican critique of this is worse than hypocritical. The Republicans want to kill you with market-based rationing. In other words, you don't have the money, you can't afford the procedure, you die that way. And that is, from the Republican point of view, more effective because you're confronted not by individuals saying no, but by the mysterious, impersonal, seemingly objective mechanisms of the market. But it's not a market, right? It's a cartel controlled by insurance companies and so forth. So we of the United Front Against Austerity wish to avoid all rationing. So no rationing, not by the market and not by a death panel, will require the following. Medicare for all. Bernie, stop calling it single payer. Nobody knows what it means. Call it Medicare for all. Everybody knows it. Everybody likes it. If you want to do this, though, you've got to come up with an immediate 10, 20 billion for a crash program to cure many of the diseases that are costing you the most. Some people say Alzheimer's is now climbing on this list, right? Alzheimer's is going to be a multi-trillion-dollar disaster. You got to find a cure. That's the only human way to make cost savings. You can't ration people to death. You got to find cures so they live. And this is also the benefit of all this for the labor force, is that we want longevity. We're going to be investing more and more in the education of every individual. They got to live longer. It's a social necessity. So a crash program. Now, if you want that money, one way to do it is to nationalize the Fed and open up a credit stimulus, the cure cancer, cure heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and all the rest. And you have a special window for that. The other problem, of course, is that the promise of medical insurance is empty unless there's a facility. The U.S. is now running a deficit of 1,000 hospitals. We have to go back to the Hill-Burton criteria, right? How many beds per 1,000 population? We need, on the whole, 1,000 modern hospitals, and we will need to train 250,000 doctors in the very near future. This was 250,000 is the figure we had at the beginning of this entire debate, and now it's still there. So we may be getting up more close to 500,000 than to 250,000. So that's the rundown here on the 13th of December, 2013. We wanted to talk. We've still got some Pearl Harbor questions hanging, some Kennedy assassination questions hanging. The person of the year, we're glad it's the Pope. It was a prophet against the whore, against the spy, and the prophet won. We're glad, and we'll see you next week. Which is the ongoing anniversary. All right, now with Syria, the other big turning point is the Seymour Hersh article about the behind-the-scenes intelligence fakery of the Ghouta massacre and the U.S. response to that in late August and September. And you will recall that the entire world was brought to the brink of a general war in the Middle East, and quite possibly World War III, on the basis of social media, thanks to Skull and Bones Kerry, and, of course, Obama, who now the world knows does not pay attention to details. He's, loftily floating off into his own narcissistic universe, or perhaps some sports game that he prefers to watch. So they were really very close to starting World War III. I would just say parenthetically, maybe the difference between Obama and somebody like Lyndon B. Johnson is that when the intelligence community organized the Gulf of Tonkin, Johnson bought it eagerly. In the case of Obama, there is at least some moment of reflection. There's at least some moment of what's good for Obama here, right? Forget about the country. We've given up on that quite a long time ago. But in the case of Obama, there is some moment of reflection or quality control or considering what the results would be, and that was, of course, that famous Friday afternoon walk around the grounds of the White House with McDonough, the head of the chief of staff at the White House. Notice that Rice and Kerry were frozen out of that particular decision. So now we get the background, and the story of this is very interesting in itself. It is Seymour Hersh, the leaker-in-chief, the establishment's well-known and well-recognized leaker. He receives leaks from networks inside these bureaucracies, the Pentagon and so forth, primarily. And that's where then we get these leaks. So he comes forward with these leaks right now. So essentially what he says is that during respect of these Syrian death squads, are they going to be dumped? And the signs, as you recall, some time ago were General Salim Idris, the CIA golden boy, who was put at the head of the so-called Syrian Military Council or Free Syrian Army. These names are changing all the time. You remember what he said. He said that he would now drop his demand that President Bashar Assad had to leave the country, quit, resign, before any Geneva conference that would be attended by the forces supposedly led by Idris, and that Assad, he said, could essentially join with him, Idris, in a united front against the Al-Qaeda terrorist killers. And that, of course, was a big change. And we were hearing about the 1,500 Westerners, people from Europe and the United States, that are now fighting with the Islamist crazies in Syria, and how everybody's now afraid that they will come back and carry out terrorist actions. And there you could already see the path to a LIHOP event, a Let It Happen on Purpose event. They're not the rule. 9/11 was not one, but this could be one if it happens, where one of these characters comes back and decides to act out the techniques. It would be a terrorist attack inspired by, although perhaps not ordered by, something like the Nusra Brigade or the ISIS. Now, the ISIS, there's always a quibble with ISIS. Is it the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria? Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. More accurate, the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and Sham. That's the term. It's an emirate. It's a subdivision of a caliphate, and that gets you a little bit closer to the essence. These are people who want the caliphate, which puts them exactly on the same page with the imperialists, right? The imperialists say there should be a world empire. They call that NATO and the International Monetary Fund, and then there should be regional warlords. That's the future they hold out to humanity. And these guys say, fine, just we don't want to call it the International Monetary Fund. We want to call it the caliphate. So remember, Idris already was signaling. And you could see that welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And it's the 13th of December here, Friday afternoon, as we tape this in Scandinavia and some other parts of the world. St. Lucy's Day. It used to be the winter solstice before the Gregorian calendar replaced the Julian back in the 1500s, although many Protestant areas didn't catch up for quite a while. They were backward for quite a few years. So we are looking at some important shifts, and in particular, what's happening with Syria. Now, we were right at the heart of this because we've just had the very successful visit of Mother Agnes Mariam here in Washington, D.C. And some of the listeners to this program have done a great deal to help make that visit a success. And she thanks you, and I thank you, and above all, world history will thank you. She addressed the McClendon Group at the National Press Club. She had meetings with a number of congressmen and senators. We'll tell you about this in a minute. And above all, she has stirred up the vermin. The vermin are in high dudgeon about her visit. And this includes BuzzFeed. It includes The Guardian. And, of course, it includes Jeremy Scahill, of whom the question is now being raised. Cop out or cop? Jeremy Scahill putting up those ultimatums. But let's look at the Syrian turning point. I urge you to go to tarpley.net and look there to see the interview I did about 2 weeks ago by now. 2 weeks ago on the 14th, I think. It was right at the beginning of December. And it was the question, could we detect signs that the U.S. is dumping the Syrian death squads, the so-called Syrian rebels, right? Now that Al-Qaeda has taken over virtually every aspect, the terrorist killers are not as prevalent as they were up there in the north. But it is, to be sure, a great watershed in this entire situation. And now we're headed towards January. And in January, we're going to have some kind of Geneva conference in effect. The Geneva conference is going to be an interesting exercise because at this point, no Islamist will come. None of the terrorist groups, not Nusra, not ISIS, not the Islamic Front, as far as I can see, is going to be represented at Geneva. So the entire thing can be decided without them. And now the various commentators are all lamenting, I suppose, since they're warmongers under the skin, especially on National Public Radio, National Pentagon Radio. Those commentators are all whining that the fulfillment of the chemical weapons accord by the Syrian government is so seamless, it's so excellent, it's conscientious, it's punctilious, it's completely satisfactory, that the U.S. now depends on Assad for that accord to be carried out, because unfortunately for them, if the killers come in, then the accord is out the window. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. It's the 13th of December. Now, of course, for your holiday viewing, don't forget the Russian fleets on C-SPAN. We're not quite up in the top of the classification as we have been. I was going neck and neck with Gnome Chomsky there for a while, and I think I outdistanced him, at least for most of the week. But if you want to do something to impact the C-SPAN programming, go and dial up that Russian fleets lecture by me, Tarpley, on C-SPAN, and maybe we can get it rebroadcast. I see that C-SPAN does rebroadcasting, and some of the stuff they rebroadcast is shall we say, unworthy. Whereas this is turning out to be, with 7,000 to 8,000 views, one of the most popular, and I haven't been able to do an exhaustive survey. It may well be the most popular Civil War event of the past, of the sesquicentennial, we might say. The world is changing. Now, the same day that Mother Agnes Mariam visited the State Department, and that was the Tuesday of this week, Tuesday, December 10th. On that Tuesday, December 10th, the State Department announced a cutoff of so-called non-lethal aid to the rebels. There's a lot of verbiage here. There's a lot of double entendre and God knows what. But the main idea is some kind of important aid, or whatever aid there is being cut off to these terrorist rebels. And that is a big change. And the justification, of course, is that there are certain warehouses in northern Syria, hard by the Turkish border, where various kinds of aid are stored. And a group of terrorist killers from the Islamic Front showed up. The Islamic Front showed up and said, hey, watch out, Nusra and ISIS are nearby, and they want to come and steal all your stuff. But we'll protect you, they said. Sounds like a fable of La Fontaine. We'll protect you. Except when they protected you, they took it all over and stole it all for themselves. Now, what's in those warehouses? Some stories say, well, generators, trucks, food, medicine, tents, other equipment, blankets, and so forth. That's the Western view. The RIA Novosti, I have to put in a good word for RIA Novosti because they're apparently not long for this world. I don't know what the exact circumstances are, but RIA Novosti says, no, wait a minute, those warehouses are full of weapons. There are at least small arms and ammunition, maybe some bazookas, maybe some RPGs, maybe some things like this. So the rebels have stolen them all. The main thing is, though, that the State Department is no longer in a position to maintain those deliveries. Now, there is a caveat. There's a proviso, which is that the U.S. is maintaining a smaller program of small arms and ammunition, which is conducted from Jordan into southern Syria. The claim is that in southern Syria,